This is Peridot. The rough is about 9 by 10 and it's shaped, this Peridot is shaped kind of like a trillion. Like I said, it's about 9 by 10 millimeters now. So I'm going to cut a signature number 4 design by Jeff Graham. So the way you orient the stone is according to the diagram. At the 96 index, you'll have one of the flat parts of the triangle. So that's the 96 index. So we've got it about oriented correctly. Olivine is the mineral for the gemstone known as peridot. Olivine receives its name from its unusual olive green color. So peridot is gem quality olivine. Peridot is the birthstone for August, and also Peridot is the gemstone for the zodiac sign of Leo. Unfortunately, Peridot is one of the few gemstones that comes in a single color. Sorry, Peridot babies, only one color for you, green, no color change. But the range of green can vary from a dark olive green to a very vivid green, and this depth of green depends on the level of iron content in the Peridot. Where can Peridot be found? Well, Peridot can be found in the Hawaiian Islands as well as the Canary Islands. It can be found in China, Burma, Australia, South Africa, Norway, Pakistan, Brazil, as well as a very large quantity of smaller sized Peridot coming from the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona. Lower quality Peridot is brownish. Pure green stones are very rare, and most Peridots are more of a yellowish green. The higher quality stones have an intense color, and most of the stones with the finest colors come from Myanmar and Pakistan. And this piece of Peridot rough has great color, and it came from Pakistan. So what design should I use to cut this with? Well, based on the shape of this rough, I'm going to cut a trillion design. Now I said trillion, not trilliant. The way BOPIE tells me to remember it is that there's the trilliant with a T on the end, and that's a triangle. And then there's the trillion without the T on the end, and that has rounded corners. So that's kind of an unofficial definition of trillion and trilliant. Now, does it matter whether you call it a trillion or a trilliant? Well, actually, yes. So since I'll be cutting a trillion, that's one with the rounded corners and not a triangle, the important thing to remember for a cutter is that when you're working on the girdle of a trillion, a very small cut in the 3 girdle facets near the center of the gemstone, the 96, 32, and 64 teeth of the 96 gear index, will result in very large cuts in the facets at the corners of the trillion. What happens is when you're trying to get the length or width of a trillion just right, it's much harder than getting the length or width of a trilliant. So it's just something to remember if you're cutting for a special order or if you're trying to get a calibrated size. So the final thing to say about Peridot is, well, you know how sometimes it can rain cats and dogs outside? Well, do you think it could ever rain Peridot? Well, it does. Yes, it rains Peridot. Not on planet Earth, but on Hops 68, it actually rains Peridot. And that would be kind of cool to see. And we know this from a NASA press release back in May of 2011. And in 2011, NASA's Spitzer Space Telescope observed what was believed to have been tiny crystals of olivine, or peridot, falling like rain through the dusty cloud of gas of a developing star. They called it olivine rain, and they thought that what occurred was the strong air currents lifted these crystallized particles of olivine off the surface of this forming star high into the atmosphere, and then dropped them when the current lost its momentum. So the result is just a rain of this glittering green olivine peridot crystals. Next time it's raining like cats and dogs outside, just think it could be peridot. Okay, I've done some preforming of our peridot. Not perfectly preformed yet, but I still have the 600 grit diamond to finish up preforming, and then the 1200. Now I use my ceramic disc. It's the flattest disc I have. I would recommend you do not buy the ceramic disc. When I bought it, when I first started faceting, it was kind of all the rage. It works great for a percentage of the cutters. So now that we've preformed our peridot, now I'm going to use a 600 grit topper from Hi-Tech. So we will continue to preform our peridot using the 600 grit. Okay, I've gone over the P1 line of instruction, which is to cut to a center point, and the P4, which is the first cut on the girdle. I did not make it a perfect triangle. And the reason I do that is there's still two more girdle cuts to cut. There's the P5 and the P6, which the P5 will slightly round this out here, and the P6 will slightly round to the end. So now I'll continue to use my 600 topper and take the first step at the rest of the instructions, including cleaning up the girdle a little bit. Then I'll move to the 1200. Okay, another little trick that's available to you is to use your permanent marker on your stones when you're cutting them. So I'm cutting the instruction P5 of the girdle, and what I want to do is cut the girdle to match this facet right here. That'll cut it here and here, and then the next instruction will cut further to this facet. So these lines, when they line up, again, using a marker helps. So let's see where we are. So we want to go a little bit further to get to this line with our girdle facet. It's easy to overcut, and using the marker helps. Right about there. So that's where we need to be for this first cut with our P5 instruction along the girdle. Okay, I finished preforming with our 600 grit diamond topper. You can see that's why I stopped and didn't make a perfect triangle, because when you cut these facets here with the girdle, it closed up very nicely our triangle. And also you can see here's where I used the marker. That's why I recommend, you have the tool there of your permanent marker. If I had cut the perfect triangle with just the first girdle facet, these other two girdle facets on each of the stones, each of the corners of the stone, total of 12 facets, would have further reduced the size of the stone, and it wasn't necessary. Now we'll move to the 1200 crystallite lap and continue to work on our peridot. I finished polishing our peridot on the pavilion, and I kept getting little chip at the very tip. I followed the line of this facet right here on all the edges. I mean, when you cut these, the first cut is the 96, 32, and 64. So between 96 and 32 is 16. So these going right down here are the 16, and then you just add 16 to 32 is 48, and 16 to 64 is 80. And I changed the angle, and I made a little star of facets on there. And that means that the pavilion, the very tip, is slightly less of an angle than the rest of it, of the pavilion. So a little triangle will help protect that little culet so it doesn't continue to chip. Now I goofed and was doing the angle wrong, and I made a little nick right here, which I polished up, and then I made it, rather than go back and recut everything, I said, okay, I'll just do it all the way around. So now we'll be ready to cut the crown of our peridot. And for our peridot, I polished it with aluminum oxide Ultra Laps. They're disposable, have aluminum oxide on the dull side, shiny side goes down. Had no problem polishing our peridot. Okay, so I'm going to transfer my Trillian cut Peridot from the crown to the pavilion dop. Trillian's not quite round, so I'm going to use two-part epoxy. I'm going to use my JB Weld. When I was fastening it, it was chipping at the very culet. So I'm going to use a little tiny piece of modeling clay, the very bottom, push it down there, make sure everything's lined up, raise the top part up, and I mix my two-part epoxy by making two little puddles. Don't need much. You need about a 50-50 mix, so the way I do it is kind of eyeball to where I have about the same size puddles. Then when you begin mixing it, you have a couple of minutes before it hardens. I'm not worried about wasting my two-part epoxy. I replace it now every year. So I'm just using a bamboo skewer and a business card. I'm going to put the epoxy on the bottom dop. Push the top onto the bottom, tighten it up, turn it over to make sure that some of the epoxy is on the stone and the dop. I don't want it running down the side of either. I don't want it to interfere when I'm cutting. And it just takes a couple minutes of maneuvering your transfer jig back and forth till the epoxy starts to harden up. And then after that hardens, I'll work on another stone today, and tomorrow I'll start working on our crown part of our Peridot. I finished polishing the crown of our Peridot, and now I'm going to set it up to cut and polish the table by using the 45-degree tabling adapter and the table aligner. I used the aluminum oxide Ultra Lap on the facets along the side of the crown, and I may use that on the table or the 60,000 grit diamond in a bat lap. We'll see how it goes. Okay, we've got the stones set up in the tabling adapter, the 45-degree tabling adapter. I did want to point out that I do set the stone up as far as I can. The further up the better. Less chance for wobble, and on rare occasions I would hear a squealing noise, and they said that most likely was due to having this down lower, and they believed that was the cause of the squealing sound. So I am now moving it up as far as I can, and I just wanted to point that out to you. Okay, I finished polishing the table of our Peridot. So now we'll weigh it. We'll soak it in acetone overnight to get the stone out of the dop, and then weigh it and send it to BOPIE. We might as well measure it now. 7.25 millimeters. Digital calipers that I use is a by eye gauging. Really like it. Turned out really well. Of course, when you start fasting, you always end up with these. I don't know why. Everybody has these. This one's not too bad, but I really like the other one. And then of course there's the cheapo plastic. All right, so we've measured it. Now we're going to soak it in acetone and weigh it and send it to BOPIE. Happy faceting, everyone.